protection, signifying the start of a till then dormant financial and economic crisis, which has been developing since 2002, but it showed its effects only in 2008 when the US economy could not manage the demand put forward for the payment of loans that were given all these years with low interest rates and easy credit conditions. Many people assume unprecedented debt loads. The problem was that this load could not be covered by the financial means that they have at their disposal. Therefore, we have the problem of the crisis that we all felt throughout the world during the last couple of years. Well, in Europe, this crisis found Europe in a very strange budgetary status. Only a few months ago, there was a balance achieved through the financial perspectives that were agreed between the Parliament and the Council and the Commission for the programming period 2007-2013. We had a budget in the European Union about 862 billion euros, which represent about 1.045% of the European Union's gross national income, gross national income, yes. And from this budget, the structural funds were given about 308 billion euros, and the common agricultural policy were given 371 billion euros. Now, this agreement, and I would like just to briefly describe the architecture before the crisis in order to understand the changes that happened after the crisis. This agreement maintained the two major components of EU spending. The first, the common agricultural policy; the second, the cohesion policy. This choice was criticized, first of all, because most of the new member states had a very high percentage of employment in the agricultural sector. Therefore, any cuts in the common agricultural policy expenditure was difficult to make. Secondary, the workings of the Doha Round demonstrated a focus on agricultural issues, and especially in poor countries. Therefore, the European Union could not avoid responding to the demand for more resources in the agricultural sector by establishing perspectives for the programming period 2007-2013 that covered this need. The second largest part, which is the cohesion policy, this one has been criticized furthermore, not just for the money it has been given, but also for its effectiveness. So far, although lots of money have been invested, I don't like the word spending, I prefer the word investment, invested in policies put forward and supported by the structural funds, the results in reducing the discrepancies between the various regions of the Union have not been very impressive, especially by focusing on the discrepancies between the new countries and the old countries of the Union. One promising aspect is the fact that the Lisbon strategy, now called Europe 2020 strategy, has been taken into account when preparing this aspect of European financing, and hopefully the priorities enshrined in that strategy, competitiveness and cohesion, will be more, let's say, substantively supported in terms of funds and of policies in the European Union context. Now, this balance, this result, has been seen as a temporary solution. It created a tangled web of regulations and conditions. If anybody takes the trouble of looking into the regulations regarding the structural funds and the money provided by the European Union through that aspect, it will feel depressed, at least, because the complexity of the regulations is so big that even those accustomed to these texts are not very, let's say, comfortable in dealing with them. For some, and I am including that part of the public opinion. The most important element of the new financial perspectives, the current financial perspectives, is the commitment undertaken by the Union's institutions to review this framework shortly. This review clause was also the means to achieve mutual concessions during the negotiation of the package 2007-2013. Now, the financial crisis provided the scenery and the impetus for this change, not just the agreement made. The thing is that the European cure for this crisis has been a mixture of policies, a mixture covering policies of a monetary aspect. If you would like to see Milton Friedman's ideas on this policy, you will find them, because you will see that many policies, many ideas were adopted with regard to reducing state action and government expenditure in order to deal with the crisis. And also, another interventionist approach was adopted, echoing Maynard Keynes' views, with using taxation or public expenses in order to improve the demand of the market. The European Commission used all these ideas to present a new proposal for the Union's budgetary architecture, focusing on three main pillars. The idea of focusing on pillars is not something new in the Union. As you know, the Union, until very recently, was based on this pillar-like structure. The first pillar was to establish a new financial market architecture, at least at European Union level. The second was to tackle the crisis on the real economy. That's something that I will deal in detail in my paper. And the third one was to provide a more global response to the crisis. The first, as I said, pillar, focusing on the banking and credit markets, will be covered mainly by the presentations of my colleagues after my own presentation. I would like just to give you some figures. Maybe they will confirm, maybe they will be supplemented by the following presentations, in order to see the amount used in order to deal with the crisis, at least in European Union level. Until May 2009, the member states, under the guidance of the European Commission and the European Central Bank, had approved an overall amount of 3.7 trillion, not billion, trillion euros to support the banks, the banking system of the Union, including 311 billion euros in capital aid, 2.9 trillion euros in guarantees, 33 billion euros for the acquisition of problematic assets, and 500 billion euros for liquidity aid at the banks. Furthermore, and that was quite recently made, there is a new mechanism in order to support the member states that are in trouble due to the financial crisis, the so-called European Stabilization Mechanism, providing loans on a bilateral basis between the member states and the International Monetary Fund to the member state in trouble. I won't get into the details of this mechanism. It's something that my colleagues will do. I would like to focus on the second pillar, supporting the real economy. Several budgetary measures have been adopted in that respect. Two levels have been identified in these measures, the procedural and the substantive. First of all, in terms of process. You know that there has been always severe criticism in the entire process of selecting a policy for funding in the European Union. There are certain stages that have been set, such as initial debates over the objectives of the budgetary arrangements of a policy. The Commission will have to put forward some proposals. These proposals will be debated by the various stakeholders and then put forward to the Council and the Parliament for approval. Exchange of views take place that sometimes can never be reconciled between them. Usually this process has been seen more as a formality rather as a substantive method of support and approval. And usually this caused what we have been seen as the indifference of the peoples of Europe, in the name of which all these measures are adopted and implemented. In this crisis, however, things change, hopefully for the best. The institutions demonstrate a somewhat different approach. They were more result-oriented instead of being process-oriented and focused. The Commission reacted promptly to the crisis. When the events of September 2008 took place in the United States, the Commission started working and in October and November 2008 put forward its proposals. This has been a very swift reply, which caused the European Council's accordingly swift reply by approving these proposals in December 2008. For the first time in the long history of the European Union institutions, these decisions were adopted without these long delays that are being noted. I would like to give you, just for comparison, a figure. The entire process in order to fix the financial perspectives for the period 2007-2013 lasted for 27 months, starting February 2004, ending May 2006. The new arrangement, the new budgetary arrangement, the entire process lasted only 3 months. September, December October, let's say, not December, September, October, December 2009. Now, in terms of substance, there is a series of measures included in this European Plan for Recovery, as the European Commission called it. First of all, there is an increase in the intervention of the European Investment Bank by providing 30 billion euros for the years 2009 and 2010, focused on the support of small and medium-sized enterprises, especially for renewable energy projects. The procedures in order to provide financing for the structural funds have been simplified. The relevant regulations have been amended. The mobilization of the possibility of direct financial support from the community budget to a project that entails the tackling of the financial crisis, as it has been identified by the Commission, has been also activated. The European Globalization Adjustment Fund, which has been an initiative put forward by President of the Commission, Mr. Barroso, has been also activated in order to provide support and support employment in the various member states. The possibility for the member states, if they so wish, to apply reduced VAT rates, something that is not the case in Greece, as you may know. The temporary exemption, and that is something very important for those involved in the financial perspectives and regarding the structural funds. The temporary exemptions for 2 years beyond the de minimis threshold. The de minimis threshold is a limit, a budgetary limit, for projects which are considered to be state aids. As you know, state aids are in principle forbidden in the context of the European Union, with some exceptions based on the cohesion policy. Well, the de minimis threshold is for small projects up to 200,000 euros, which are allowed to go ahead and provide direct support to enterprises without being considered forbidden state aids. Well, this threshold was increased to 500,000 euros. And last but certainly not least, and especially for the implementation of the project, the use of the so-called accelerated procedures in the directive for public procurement of the European Union. There are certain procedures which reduce the time limit of a tendering process from 87 days to 30 days, with reduced time limits and so on. This acceleration was also allowed. Now, the substantive aspects of the economic recovery of the European Economic Recovery Plan are two. First of all, measures financed by the national budget of the member states, something that my colleagues will refer to, and measures supported by the union's budget. The measures provided by the national budgets are to be implemented within the framework of the Growth and Stability Pact. The budgets financed under the European Union's budget have to be implemented under the, let's say, cover of the Lisbon strategy. This budgetary architecture has a very strong element of investment in human capital, supporting employment. What do I mean by that? The idea is to promote employability, long-term employability, not just temporary employment, rather than particular job, by providing skills and then covering the necessity to move between jobs, while at the same time the skills provided to the labor force will meet the labor market's needs. These measures are supported by the European Social Fund, include specialized vocational training, professional job counseling, apprenticeship, subsidized employment, grants, credits for self-employment, and so on. New schemes in order to support entrepreneurship have been developed. The so-called 4Js, if you have heard the acronym. First of all, Jeremy, the Joint European Resources for Micro and Medium Enterprises, which focuses on new business creation and small and medium enterprises expansion. And Jasmine, Joint Action to Support Microfinance Institutions in Europe. This has been a novel idea in order to provide microcredit, support microcredit providers which are not banks. So small and short-term loans are to be given to new enterprises, not necessarily by banks, but by other providers which have the financial capacity to support such schemes. The third one is Jaspers. Jaspers is the joint assistance in supporting projects in European regions, providing assistance to managing authorities mainly. This is more of an administrative support scheme. And Jessica, the final J, Joint European Support for Sustainable Investment in City Areas, focusing on investment of sustainable development, energy efficiency, urban transport, regeneration of the urban environment. Having seen all that, and not wishing to exceed the time limits that I have been set, I would like to conclude by saying that the speedy amendment of the entire architecture of the European Union in order to provide for these schemes that I just referred to, and in the Q&A section I might be able to give some more details, has demonstrated that if the European institutions are really interested in tackling with the problem, they can do so. The problem is to be convinced to do so, either by political means or by social pressure. My experience with the European Union's institutions demonstrates that there are people there who know what they are doing. However, they have to be pushed in order to do their job properly. The key word now in the European Union is not just making things work, but making things work efficiently, and especially making things work in terms of financial and budgetary efficiency. Hopefully, this experience will allow the Union to learn its lesson, and when the time comes for the next programming period in 2011 and 12 to start the relevant negotiation, the time framework will be much smaller, and the result of the effort will be much more efficient and result-oriented. Thank you very much for your attention.
In the past few months, the attention of the media and of public opinions at large has undoubtedly been drawn to the so-called Greek tragedy, namely the unexpectedly precipitous and deep budgetary crisis of that country member of the EU, coupled with gradual revelations as to the extent of falsification of its statistical data on public deficit and debt. For several months, the focus has been on the short-term operational dimension of a particular country's, namely Greece's, financial difficulties due to its budgetary derailment. Consequently, the issue discussed by EU institutions during that period has been that of the inaptitude of a specific country's institutions to manage its sovereign debt. That, of course, is understandable because it is only human that what is actually happening always takes priority over longer-term problems, or even worse, over structural deficits of the common political tools we Europeans have devised. But by now, it is universally acknowledged that even though in the history of Europe the Greek saga will be considered as an event of primary importance with dramatic overtones, there are underlying issues of economic governance, of the EU Eurozone, and of the EU overall itself overall. Thus, the Greek case will have served, hopefully, as my colleague said, as an instrument to help us prevent similar problems occurring in the future and provide stability for the common currency on a viable basis. Now, in order to assess the efficiency of the EU institutions' mechanisms to manage budgetary crises like the one we're living at present, we have to parse through the structural problems of the common economic and monetary policies of the EU, starting, of course, from the highest level, that of the treaty itself, and then proceeding to secondary European law, namely, notably, the preventive and corrective arms of the Stability and Growth Pact, as well as EU macroeconomic practices. The imbalance between the monetary aspect of the Economic and Monetary Union, I will henceforth refer to as EMU, which is sufficiently consolidated and has autonomous management, on the one hand, and the economic dimension, which is weak and vague, on the other, has been criticized from the outset, so I won't be rephrasing the, of course, totally justified criticism. I will try to show sometimes through a quick comparison with the federal model's analogous mechanisms, notably the American ones, that because of these structural deficits, we in Europe have been largely improvising after the fact and costly ways of toughening up budgetary discipline and proposing crisis-busting solutions, whereas coordinated solutions, not only to deficit and debt, but most profoundly, most importantly, to competitiveness and growth problems would be the only rational solution. In sum, the EU's main problem is that, due to the peculiarities of the so-called community method, we have more or less been striking ad hoc and hardly, in my opinion, manageable compromises, and then generalizing them in an inductive fashion, instead of laying down a priori, if you want, clear, strong, efficient, general rules of prevention and sanction in favor of macroeconomic stability and competitiveness. More specifically regarding the euro, despite the voices of many great European figures such as that of Jacques Delors, who kept repeating for years that it is macroeconomically irrational to have a single currency without coordinated state economic policies, until recently we naively thought that we could manage a monetary union only through some regulation and supervision. Nevertheless, the whole architecture of the Maastricht Treaty and the Stability and Growth Pact, based on, let's say, three pillars, on a strict system of purely national responsibility for the rates of public deficit and debt, a no bailout clause, and a European Central Bank, ECB, henceforth, policy of no monetization of public debts, is now drawing to an end, as we see, after having deceived even its most fervent supporters. So, what makes a budgetary crisis global? That's the first issue. The first and foremost EU problem, EU institutions have proven unable to manage, or even to predict its existence in the first place, is that of assessing when a financial problem showing up in one or more EU member states can be qualified as a short-term liquidity, a mid-term loaning, or a long-term default problem. In other words, we haven't yet been able to lay down our primary economic rules, namely the rules on the production, reform, and abolishment of rules on rules, namely who is responsible, in what circumstances, to say authoritatively that it is the EU and not a specific member state that is facing a deficit and debt problem, and also to decide that the problem is a conjunctional or a structural one. As we also recently in the Greek case, all the Eurozone governments hid behind the sacrosanct rule, no default, no rescue, no exit from the EMU for member states, in order to deny for a long period of time, more than 6 months, that there even was any solvability problem for a member state. Unfortunately, this state of denial invited speculator short-selling practices, which remain largely unregulated, and eventually brought about a contagion of the Greek crisis, which revealed the existence of a systemic, fortunately, crisis of the whole Eurozone structure. Now, if we read the treaty, the only legal basis we can find for a coordinated EU response to a financial crisis is in Article 122, paragraph 2 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, that states, where a member state is in difficulties or is seriously threatened with severe difficulties caused by natural disasters or exceptional occurrences beyond its control, the Council, on a proposal from the Commission, may grant, under certain conditions, Union financial assistance to the member state concerned. That is the legal basis for the 750 billion euro European stabilization mechanism to preserve financial stability, decided recently by the ECOFIN Council on May 9, 2010. Yet, the continuous tergiversations and the prevalence of short-sighted nationalistic reflexes among some European governments delayed considerably this interpretation of the treaty. By contrast, very briefly, in federal systems, where there necessarily is a Treasury Department, the assessment of systemic financial risks is not left to the unwitting judgment of an intergovernmental organ, such as the Eurogroup in the EU, but action is instead taken up by federal authorities to contain the risk. Expediency and celerity of action are crucial in such cases, and only a centralized organ such as the ECB in the EU can ensure that. The foremost of all EU's institutional shortfalls underlying the current acute crisis we're living now in Europe probably is the problem of the EU's incapacity to account for and to handle member states' competitiveness deficits. Neither the so-called preventive Council Regulation number 1055 of 2005, nor the so-called corrective Council Regulation number 1056 of 2005 arms of the Stability and Growth Pact make any serious reference to the problem of competitiveness disequilibria between several member states, as this is easily revealed through a simple comparison between the long-term trends in national balances of payments. The Stability and Growth Pact solely imposes medium-term budgetary objectives to all participating member states through a mechanism of mutual surveillance of national stability programs implementation. This is due to the fact that the pact officially recognizes the existence of only economic and budgetary heterogeneity in the Union. The founding principles of the Eurozone, namely the lack of co-responsibility for member states' public debts and the separation between monetary and budgetary policies, popularly known as the no bailout clause of Articles 123 to 125 of the treaty, were devised conspicuously after the insistence of German political authorities at the time the Maastricht Treaty was enacted in 1991, in order precisely to prevent a European mutualization of national deficits and a monetization of debts that would have resulted in inflationary tendencies. Yet, in reality, the above-mentioned fundamental principles are endangered by financial assistance to a defaulting member state only when direct transfers are made without any concern for the underlying competitiveness disequilibria between member states. In other words, our principles are more endangered by the lack of any indicator or reference value on competitiveness in our treaties than by the imaginary danger of having Eurozone members assume sovereign debts of their partners or of the ECB continually expanding the monetary mass by buying Eurozone public and private bonds on the secondary market. It is extremely difficult to treat the EU's underlying comparative competitiveness problems, much more so than the debt problem, to which I will come back right afterwards, since Germany, the main European exporting force, needs to freeze salary increases and thus its internal demand in the name of its external competitiveness. Germany's Eurozone partners need to regain some of their lost external competitiveness grounds since the commencement of the EMU, and the ECB has as its principal statutory objective, as you all know, the maintenance of price stability, which means an average inflation rate of no more than 2%. These three objectives cannot be fulfilled at the same time, and there certainly is no institution in the EU to impose some political priorities here. The economic logic, as well as the long-term interest of the Eurozone ensemble, seems to me to be for the German government to accept a shift towards a stimulus of its internal demand and a slightly, yet permanently, higher inflation rate. The only problem is that in the EU institutional setting, these requirements might take the form of recommendations by the ECB or of Mr. Olli Rehn, the European Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, but have no normative force whatsoever. I come to the second now problem, lack of sufficiently coordinated debt management mechanisms. A country like Greece today that faces grave problems, such as a continuous shrinking of its industrial basis, high unemployment rates, especially among young people and women, and an expanding brain drain, but also, and above all, its main structural problem of a political system of extremely poor quality, and of the subsequent lack of state administrative capacity due to extensive corruption and lawlessness, is facing the spectrum of a deflationary spiral and a deep internal recession, only partly recompensed by imported growth. The problem was aggravated, of course, as we all know, by many mistakes in its handling by the Greek government and by the delay of the solution by EU institutions. In such a context, the very hard budgetary adjustment measures included in the tripartite stabilization mechanism, European Commission, European Central Bank, IMF, International Monetary Fund, that Greece decided to activate in order to drastically cut its public deficit and later on its public debt, even though necessary at a short-term level, might end up as a time bomb for Europe that Europe will pay dearly. In the wake of the Greek crisis and in the midst of a continuous decrease in the credibility of the euro, as we are seeing these days, in both international markets and central banks around the globe, the EU decided to generalize the Greek experience and establish a quite similar European stabilization mechanism as a preventive measure against the possible collapse of Eurozone members and as a protection of the common currency. I will hereafter briefly describe the mechanism structure before I proceed to a comparative assessment, and then end with my conclusions. The European Stabilization Mechanism is, of course, tantamount to a guilty plea, as we lawyers say. The Stability and Growth Pact's preventive and corrective mechanisms, providing for a multilateral surveillance of state budgetary discipline, have proven deficient. The new mechanism is comprised of three parts. First, loan guarantees for defaulting states by Eurozone member states, with up to 440 billion euros committed that can be gathered following unanimous decision. Second is an IMF contribution, expected to be up to the half of the sum committed by member states. And third, Eurobonds, up to a sum of 60 billion euros raised on financial markets by the European Commission and then lent under the same conditions as they were borrowed to the debt-stricken state, what we call back-to-back loans. Complementary to that decision, fourth, the ECB, the European Central Bank, decided to start buying government and private bonds, irrespectively of the sovereign debt's rating by international credit rating agencies, the so-called nuclear option, offset by liquidity-absorbing operations. Now, the IMF loan-granting procedures are quick and efficient and are part and parcel with a very low interest rates and strict conditionality exigencies. And the old idea of Eurobonds, issued by the Commission, is materializing at last and will undoubtedly give a great boost to European solidarity. Yet, there are some important institutional setbacks in the mechanism. First of all, an intergovernmental organization, namely the IMF, has officially been instituted as a co-regulator of all future EU budgetary crises. Secondly, due mainly to the intergovernmental logic characterizing Eurozone procedures, the solution to future budgetary crises will sometimes at least be hostage to the internal political procedures of election cycles of any member state, which can amount to a real moral hazard. Now, if we compare quickly the EU mechanism to federal support mechanisms, for example, of the USA, its whole structure seems quite faulty. In similar cases, US Treasury bonds have been issued to support a state risking default. In some cases, a credit line has been opened to face grave liquidity problems. A mutually accepted and federally guaranteed debt restructuring scheme can be put in place. And of course, all these decisions have been taken by federal institutions without any interference by other states' internal politics. No American citizen can imagine the fate of California, for example, a state with a huge public deficit, depending on the negotiation with and political acceptance of its budgetary stabilization mechanism by 49 other state governors, and afterwards on the parliamentary approval of its rescue plan by 49 state legislators. Despite these institutional drawbacks, this new European tool is most certainly welcome. Still, we definitely need a more long-term approach, going beyond an urgent management of financial turbulences. That means that the EU needs a common framework for the drawing of long-term structural policies and for macroeconomic management. In a monetary union, these two types of policies, together with growth measures, cannot be left to the sheer discretion of each government with dire consequences. It is my belief that we need a permanent mechanism of budgetary transfers between member states if we want the euro to survive. I will not be pursuing this lead, of course, because of lead of time. Now, as the Greek case showed all too well, the scenarios of a possible unilateral sovereign debt restructuring by national political authorities spread panic in financial markets and contributed heavily to the grave deterioration of Greece's borrowing capacities. Studies have shown that a country that unilaterally asks from its creditors to renegotiate downwards the size of its debt and thus technically defaults, suffers a permanent damage not only of its international credibility, of course, but also of its productive basis, as much as 3 times that of a state that restructures its debt in a commonly accepted framework. The Greek experience shows by hindsight that if a debt restructuring conference were organized under the auspices of the European Commission and the European Central Bank, say in the last trimester of 2009, instead of the whole psychodrama we've lived in these months, the cost of a possible default would fall so sharply that derivatives such as the credit default swaps guaranteeing against the risk of a state payment cessation would not be so attractive to speculators. And even though private creditors, of course, such as banks and pension funds, would stand to lose some money, they would push through a plan spreading out in time the country's sovereign debt, and then would transform that country's debts into securities guaranteed by an EU multilateral solidarity fund and bought thereafter by international investors. Of course, such a corrective scheme would presuppose the setting up of a permanent EU preventive mechanism assuring an effective budgetary control, together with some medium-term budget consolidation measures that have been actually, the case adopted by Greece. So on May 12, 2010, the Commission tabled a proposal to reform the economic governance of the EU and the Eurozone, whereby EU countries will review each other's draft annual budgets before they are adopted at national level. Following the early peer review system, closer budgetary surveillance would be carried out in the first half of the year during a so-called European semester, before EU governments prepare their national budgets and economic reform programs. By coordinating in advance national budgetary and fiscal policies, the EU will ensure that national budgets are consistent with the European dimension and will prevent member states from putting at risk the financial stability of other member states and of the euro. Also, under the Commission's plans, assessments of longer-term national economic reform programs would be synchronized with budget discipline review through a scoreboard reviewing macroeconomic indicators such as productivity, unit labor costs, employment, public debt, etc. This tighter multilateral surveillance system, which for the first time in European history implies a partial transfer of state sovereignty in budgetary matters, will be supported by a system of speedier penalty procedures so as to deter violations, as well as of incentives so as to reward budgetary discipline. These two mechanisms taken together have the undoubted capacity to bring about a gradual federalization of the EU, a true quantum leap in the governance of the euro area, as the ECB President Jean-Claude Trichet put it. So I conclude. In any case, the lessons we have learned from the mismanagement of the global budgetary crisis mechanism in the EU revolve around the following at least 3 basic requirements that we must absolutely integrate in our institutional settings. First, we need a definition of clearer and stricter rules and a more efficient mutual budgetary supervision mechanism. The facts have proved that the current rules can be quite easily circumvented. The system of controls at EU level must therefore be strengthened, including those for monitoring statistical data. Second, we have to restore respect for the rules and practices guaranteeing sustainability of public finances and stability of the euro. It was enough for a single member state, like Greece with limited economic weight, to infringe the rules and cause the value of the euro to fall sharply for all. Consequently, governments should no more enjoy total discretionary power to define their economic policy mix through their national budgets or otherwise, without due and timely regard to the European-wide implications of their basic political decisions. And third, lastly, we need a tougher, but also, I may say, smarter system of sanctions to deter unsustainable national budgetary and fiscal policies. Suspending community funding to countries that admittedly infringe the rules would not be appropriate, because that would aggravate the situation of a country in crisis and a people in difficulty. Other penalties, such as the suspension of voting rights in the Council, can be productive if used as an ultima ratio, as a remedy of last resort. And as for the exclusion of a country from the Eurozone, that is, in my opinion, the single most unacceptable solution, taking into account the message of weakness such an unconscionable move would give to international markets, central banks, and the political establishment of our international partners around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yanni. And I will invite our next speaker, Lidida Rova, and her colleagues will speak about Albania and the recent world crisis, economic growth, or political illusion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello to everyone. Before starting my presentation, I'm going to thank my 2 colleagues, Ms. Alketa Beko and Ms. Liliana Zuberi, for the enormous help they give me to finish this paper. The aim of this paper is to study some of the macroeconomic indices of the Albanian economy on the basis of official data released by national institutions such as Bank of Albania, Ministry of Finance, and Albanian Institute of Statistics. The question whether Albania has been affected by this crisis or not still remains unanswered. Regarding the answer to this question, there are two approaches which surprisingly are not based on concrete economic evidence or official data, but on political attitudes. The political force in office does not accept that Albania has been affected by the economic crisis, whereas the opposition forces, which not being part of the decision-making institutions, overemphasizes the negative effects of the crisis that has gripped Albania. Allow me to paraphrase Mark Twain. He said, "There are lies, damned lies, and statistics. We do believe that statistics in Albania are something more than damned lies." This paper manifests the following limitations. Albanian institutions have not released data after the year 2009. In our paper, we will analyze the macroeconomic situation in Albania until this point in time. We strongly believe that political attitudes in Albania have interfered with the official data, so we have our doubts regarding any figure you will see in the presentation. Okay, few words about the Western world crisis. The financial crisis was officially accepted on 14 September 2008 in USA, in the house mortgage sector, and its impact was rapidly spread in many parts of the world, such as Europe, Asia, and now almost the whole world suffer from it. The countries which have not been affected from the financial crisis, like Albania, for example, which have a rudimentary form of the financial market, are affected for sure from the depression into this crisis turned on. Global economy has not been affected by such a crisis since the Great Depression, 1929. The nature and the characteristic of this crisis, due to the major developments in the last decades and the high globalization level, make it different from all previous ones. Okay, in this table there are some macroeconomic indicators for the last 2 years and the forecast for the year 2010. The sources are Eurostat, some respective institutes of statistics, Bank of Albania, and of course, European Commission forecast released in autumn 2009. Well, as we can see, except France, all the countries showed in the table faced deterioration in the real GDP growth, moving from the year 2008 to the year 2009. They shift from positive to negative figures. Good news about 2010, and we will see if they will be like this or not. The European Commission forecast showed a positive real growth for the countries we took into consideration in this table. In some cases lower than 1%, but at least is positive. Unemployment rate is quite high for Eurozone and USA and France, and we can see deflation moving from the year 2008 to the year 2009, and a little bit of improvement moving from the year 2009 to the year 2010. Okay, now let's stay a little bit Balkan plus Italy. Regarding the Balkan region, we can see that only Albania released a positive and quite high GDP real growth for the year 2008 and 2009. The forecast for the year 2010 is very low for Croatia and Greece, but at least is positive. The 3-year average is positive and high for Albania, you can see is 5.1%. Negative for Turkey, Croatia and Italy. Positive for Serbia and Fyrom and Greece. The unemployment rate for Albania is 12.7%, but this is not the real figure, because from the year 1992, all the villagers who benefit land were removed from the unemployment scheme. So we do think that the unemployment rate in Albania is something more than 30%. The GDP real growth for the year 2008 was 7.9%. The GDP real growth for the year 2009 was, according to statistic institution to Instat, 4.1%, and according to Bank of Albania, 3%. For the year 2009, the GDP real growth was on the decrease from quarter to quarter. We can see the first quarter 6%, 5.3% the second, 4.1% the third, and just 1.7% the fourth quarter, with an average 4.3%. Aggregate demand components. Private consumption, the last quarter of 2009, was on the decrease for the first time from the year 2005. Public expenditures are increased with 30% annually, comparing 2009 with 2008, but this increase is financed by budget deficit growth, whereas public incomes had an increase only 2.7% on 2009. Public investments had an average growth in 2009, 1.4%. Private investments are on the decrease on the year 2009. We doesn't have data for this. The import of capital goods, which is an indirect indices of the private investment climate, decreases with 12.7% in the year 2009. Foreign trade. During the transition period, the foreign trade sector has been the most problematic sector of the Albanian economy. On average, during the last 10 years, the imports were 3.7 times higher than the exports, and this figure remained unchanged during the year 2008. Comparing the years 2007, 2008, and 2009, we can see a deterioration of a decrease of the export levels and also a decrease on the import levels. Comparing the years 2007, 2008, and 2009 as percentage of GDP, after an increase of the imports and exports level from the year 2007 to the year 2008, there is a decrease moving from the year 2008 to the year 2009. If we will compare the first quarters of 4 successive years, 2006, 2007, 2008, and 2009, after a trend of increase moving from the years 2006, 2007, and 2008, in the year 2009 we can see decrease in the level of imports and exports and generally a deterioration of the situation of the foreign trade. Emigrant remittances. Labor force is the highest export of Albania economy, and we all know that the main compensation of this export are remittances. More than 1 million of Albanians live and work abroad, mainly in Greece and Italy. According to Eurostat, 640,000 Albanians lives and works in Greece, but we think that this figure is something more than this. And in Italy, 400,000 Albanians lives and works there. It's very difficult to make a realistic assessment to the remittance flows in Albania for a lot of reasons. 60% of Albanian remittances are made by informal channels, and Bank of Albania used to register only remittances transferred by the official networks, when the other part is only estimated. This means that the data about remittance flows in Albania are, for a large part, estimates. Remittances are equal to an economic sector in Albania, to the agriculture sector. They help to reduce poverty, help on the appreciation of local currency, but remittances have not been able to produce a substantial growth in the country. They go mostly for consumption and not for investments. It's not released yet the amount of emigrant remittances for the year 2009. In the year 2008, remittances are 60% lower than the previous year, and this trend continues even in the year 2009. The first quarter of 2009, emigrant remittances decreased with 7.7%, comparing with the first quarter of 2008. The third quarter is the same trend, a decrease with 6% in emigrant remittances, again comparing with the third quarter of 2008. And for the year 2009, shows a decrease in total approximately by 6.5%. This is due to 2 reasons. The first one is the economic crisis that have gripped Greece and probably Italy, and the second, the naturalization process of Albanian emigrants. Exchange rate. Analyzing the exchange rate dynamics in the domestic market, it comes out that in the last decade, from 1999 to 2008, Albanian lek is appreciated against the two main currencies, the US dollar and euro. The exchange rate Albanian lek for US dollar in 1999 was 137.7, when in 2008 was just 88 leks, a depreciation of the US dollar with 36%. The exchange rate Albanian lek for euro in 1999 was 147 leks, when in 2008 was 123.8, a depreciation of the euro with 60%. As we can see in the chart, in the year 2009 the situation is different. Albanian lek is depreciating against both currencies. Thus, the US dollar costs now 96 leks, is 40.4% higher than in 2008, when euro costs 138.21, is 12.5% higher than in 2008. Foreign direct investments. The Albanian government seeks to attract foreign direct investments as they have an important impact on the economic growth of a country. Albanian economic freedom score in 2009 was 63.7. Its level of economic freedom is increased by 1.3 points during the past year, and it has improved in 3 of the 10 freedoms. Albania is ranked 27th freest among the 43 countries in the Europe region. Nevertheless, FDIs in Albania are the lowest in the region. Albania, ignored by foreign investors, is an article published on March 2008 by Premier Global Property News Service. Until 2005, Albania was the country with the lowest cumulative foreign direct investment flows in CAA region. The situation has been on the improve the years later. In the year 2008 and 2009, there is an increase, as you can see in the chart, on the level of FDIs. Moving from the year 2007 to the year 2008, there is an increase with 43%. But this is mainly due to the privatization process and not due to an improvement of the investment climate in Albania. Budget deficit is deteriorating in the last 2 years. As percentage of GDP, budget deficit is 26.2% higher in 2008 than in 2007, and 45.8% higher in 2009 than in 2007. Public debt is increasing the last 3 years, arriving 59.5% in the year 2009. Comparing internal with external debt, the first one is increased more than the second. General overview. Albania's economy has improved substantially over recent years and has outperformed many other countries in the region. However, it is still considered one of the poorest countries in Europe. The per capita income was 3,675 in 2008 and is expected to reach 4,000 in 2009. 12.4% of the population lived below the poverty line in 2008, marking a considerable improvement from the year 2002, when 25.4% of the population lived below the poverty line. The official unemployment rate is 12.7% in 2009. In April 2009, the International Monetary Fund predicted that Albania would be one of the 2 countries in Europe to enjoy a positive growth rate for 2009, but lower remittances from Albanian workers abroad, mostly in Greece and Italy, and smaller exports will put a strain on economic activity. The global financial crisis has reduced Albanian citizen trust of commercial banks, even though the domestic banking sector has remained largely isolated from the crisis. Although bank deposits dropped by 10% since September 2008, withdrawals have diminished recently and deposits have stabilized during the second quarter of 2009. Lower liquidity has forced commercial banks to tighten lending procedures. In February 2009, the growth rate of loans dropped to 29% from 35% in 2008. In general, The banking sector remained viable and able to further finance the economy, as the ratio of loans to deposit, approximately 65%, is still low compared to Western standards. Fiscal and monetary discipline has kept inflation relatively low, averaging roughly 2.9% per year during the years 2006-2008. In the year 2008, inflation increased to 3.4%, still within the target range set by the Bank of Albania. In 2009, inflation rate was 3.1%. In this table is showed with red color a deterioration of the macroeconomic indices and with a green color an improvement of them. As we can see, most of the macroeconomic indices are deteriorating from the year 2008 to the year 2009. At a time when almost all the countries in the world have been bringing forward policies to keep the crisis under control in their respective countries, Albanian authorities are far from introducing such policies. We arrived at this conclusion based on the reason analyzed in this paper. The Albanian government has not yet accepted the fact that Albania has been affected by the recent world crisis. Under such circumstances, we suggest that the Albanian financial and decision-making authorities take into consideration the following recommendations. Firstly, the Albanian government should accept the unfavorable economic situation despite the willingness to name it a crisis or otherwise. The official institutions should release more transparent and realistic figures. They should avoid delays and political interference with them as factors which both result in releasing misleading data. The Albanian authorities should take immediate action to introduce new economic and social policies which would be able to prevent the further deterioration of the economic situation. The Albanian government should increase the level of cooperation with the international institutions such as IMF, World Bank, and the like. Thank you.
We still have time for discussions and comments, so feel free to ask questions and direct to a specific presenter. And also, I would like to remind my students that they have to ask a couple of questions as well. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I would like to ask something to our second speaker, Mr. Yannis Papadopoulos. You're saying that the EU should proceed to a federal model of both economic and political governance. I would like to ask you if you think that something like that is feasible, taking into consideration that we are 27 different nations in EU, and the social unrest that something that a kind of project could lead to in Europe. Thank you.
I'm not sure I quite get the question. If it is feasible, not only is it feasible, as I said, it is mostly indispensable. Now, if we are even more a fortiori, as we say, for a stronger reason, that we are 27, and an intergovernmental organ like for example, the Eurogroup is not efficient. There might be some political implications in the future because of the requirement of a unanimity decision that are so scary that we don't even want to imagine them. So I think that the only possible solution is to go towards that, of course with the community method that we have. We cannot change our political tools from one day to another. But I think that this has been the underlying cause of the change, the shift, the paradigm shift of the European Central Bank's practices and philosophy, and also the underlying cause of the European Commission's latest proposals. We have them, they're like very recent, this proposal for regulation for the the mutual budgetary surveillance system. All these things lead towards a more, let's call it, federalization model. Now, of course, we can see, I didn't have the time to develop that, we are seeing already that there are many reactions to that. especially coming from big countries, even France, for example. The French budgetary minister, the Minister of Budget, said that, you know, we have something called national sovereignty and parliaments, and they vote budgets, and we would like to continue to do that, because that's the way it has been for like 700 years, since Magna Carta, more or less. Well, that's all right by me. I mean, for my standards, it's all right, but this is more, I would say, political metaphysics and reality. Reality is what it is. If we really want to have a euro, if we really want, as I said in my paper, to impose some political priorities, some macroeconomic, some structural policies long-term, and of course some growth strategies, so-called Lisbon strategy and now EU 2020, this cannot happen with the system we have. It's a system that is totally broken down. So it's not a question of option, it's a question of necessity. The only problem is that there are internal political costs, as I said, and I imply to specific governments that we all know who they are. These past 5 or 6 months, I said that they are hostages to internal political and election cycles, and this is scandalous. This cannot continue. It is, as I said, it is as if California saving rescue, budgetary rescue, were dependent upon 49 other states saying, yes, I will, you know, I accept to borrow in order to lend to California, and then 49 state, you know, congresses, legislators saying, okay, this is ridiculous. This cannot continue. So either we do it, or consequences will be dire, not only for Greece, of course, but also for the euro and also for the European Union. We won't have any European Union anymore. We don't even know if we're going to teach these lessons, me and my colleague, like in 3 or 4 years' time from now. So it's not a question of option. It's just a question of necessity and of rationality.
Thank you. Next, please. Can you please introduce yourself so we start knowing each other? And
University of Linz. I strongly object what you are saying. You completely leave out institutions. You can solve such a problem also having better institutions. You typically have the benevolent dictator approach. You say we must have. Yeah? First, there are 27 nations, and the comparison to the US is wrong. Yes, the US is a federal country, Europe is not. We have 27 independent states, and we have 27 independent voters. You have to convince first the voters that they want to have a unified fiscal federal policies. If you don't do this, you will utterly fail, because the people in your country, in my country, won't follow you. So, if you don't have a convincing strategy why we should have a federal fiscal policy and showing that this is a better one than we have now, as the proof is not as easy as you think, then I think you will fail. You can also make reforms, and here I think it would be a much better strategy in the European institutions, in the Maastricht Treaty, make some additions, some extra paragraphs which could easily be ratified if the European member states wanted, even having a referendum in Ireland, and then solve this problem that if members violate rules, they have certain consequences to follow. So I think that would be the only way. Now to have a quick common fiscal policy is, I think, won't work at all. And in the United States, the best counterexample, you don't have it. California has a different policies than Texas, than Connecticut. I know the US quite well. And, and California has to solve its problems. It might get some federal help in an emergency crisis like the state of New York did get it a few years back. So I would really say, this is an utopia, this is a dream what you are proposing in drastic words, yeah? And saying the EU will collapse, I think, is no solution at all. The EU will not collapse. Yeah? The EU acts under pressure, but transforming everything to Brussels, we have not always made good experience. Look at European agricultural policy, etc. So if you don't have, again, then very solid and good institutional framework, will be very difficult. And imagine if the more or less complete power to tax is taken away from this country, transferred to Brussels. Yeah? whether your voters or the Austrian or the German voters would accept this, yeah? And more or less, this is, I overstated now, is what you mean, yeah? Because then you can control budget deficit, etc. So I think the chance here is in plurality, in competition, and in good institutions on the European Union, so that the states know very well if they violate the Maastricht Treaty or if they do other things, then you might have an emergency fund like we have it, will have it quite soon, for crisis coming from outside. This world financial crisis was not caused in the US, it came from the United States. Yeah? So this is a different situation. But for the future perspective of the European Union, first thing you can only do if the people want them. We have democracies here and you have to respect this. Or you go back to dictatorships and everything else is much easier. But maybe people don't want this. And second, think much more in institutions. What went wrong with the Maastricht Treaty? Make research and ideas here. That, I think, for me, is the only possible way to come out of this crisis.
I don't know if I have, because there's no definite question, but there was a positioning by my colleague, Professor Schneider. So I don't know if I have to reply. I didn't.
You don't have to.
Okay. So it's not technically a reply. It's a commentary and a commentary. So, but I do have to comment, though. I never talked about, neither I nor the European Commission, who is the main source of this utopic plan. It's not me, it's the European Commission. Never talked about common fiscal policies. Of course not. I never even talked about common budgetary policies. Of course not. We talked about, and I think, and I strongly insist that it is a necessity, we talked about a common framework in order to mutually support and surveil the budgetary procedures and, of course, the fiscal policies and the growth measures in our 27 member states. It's a totally different thing. We never talked about Brussels saying to us, telling us Greeks or you Austrians what our policy mixes will be. But we are definitely talking about the peer review system that that the Commission presented some days ago, whereas national political establishments may no longer be may enjoy total discretionary power to spend as they like. This is not viable. I'm sorry to say. Our Greek case showed that this is not sustainable. And I don't think the people of Greece, if you want my opinion, want that either. And so I think that there are many of us here who really want the European Union to be a union and not, just nominally a union, okay? And I really want some of us, I really think that many of us here, probably most of the Greek people, are by now sure that the grave political problems, the political systems, our political systems deficits that led us to that situation, this tragic situation that we are living right now, is, of course, no longer imaginable in the near future. And, of course, that it's not only a Greek problem, as I said, it's a systemic problem for the Eurozone. Either we have, we cannot have, in very simple words, we cannot have a monetary union. All of us, put our treasures, our capital inside this common, currency, and then do not have some basic structures of common budgetary surveillance, of competitiveness, also problems management. This is totally lame as a structure. I think everybody agrees. There's no one disagreeing anymore. Even Germans, as I said, who are the main architects, for good or for bad, of the Maastricht Treaty, of the Growth and Stability Pact, the architecture that I presented with the independence of each country's own, the sovereignty of each country's debts, and the ECB's non-monetization of debts, of public debts. Even these people now understand, and we know that because we're reading the papers and we know what they say in the Council, now understand that the whole architecture of the Maastricht Treaty, the corrective and the preventive arms of the Stability and Growth Pact are dead. They haven't worked. It was a crash test. That's it. Over.
I'm not an economist. Therefore, the perspective of institutional economics that Professor Schneider introduced is something that appeals to me from my legal background. What I would like to say that in European Union law we have developed two concepts that can be useful in this very interesting discussion. The concept of coordination and the concept of harmonization. These are two concepts that in principle they seem very similar, but there is a universe separating them. The coordination sector is something that puts all policies together and forms a single policy. That is something that, that's why the main instrument in order to promote coordination is the regulation, which is directly applicable and so on. The harmonization part is something completely different. It has separate national policies that are being formulated or implemented along the same lines, but they keep their separate identities and particularities. Therefore, I believe that Professor Schneider's intervention had this in mind, at least from a legal point of view, the fact that, of course, the peoples of Europe have to be convinced that they have to accept something more of a coordinated nature, which is a common budgetary, fiscal, economic policy. But at the moment, and this is something that we have to work with, is first of all to harmonize our policy, try to harmonize. It's not something that we are sure that we will succeed. It's very difficult because each national economy has its own particular details, which are not similar and cannot be changed overnight. Therefore, the harmonization process is something that should come first. The discussion over that and the instrument that will be used in that respect, of course, is something that is open to discussion. And of course, the European Commission, being the federalistic arm of the European Union's executive, puts forward the coordinating method first. But in my view, at least, the harmonizing part comes first. We should try to see which can be the harmonizing paces between the various policies, and then try to go to a single policy. That's something that, as you said, might seem as an utopia at the moment. If someone spoke about a coordinated fiscal policy, at the moment must have something completely different in mind, not the actual EU as it stands now. And I believe that working in the European institutional system, having in mind the harmonizing element, could give us solution to that quest, if you want. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I will take one last question, short question, with a short answer and all that. Okay? So, that's to... Go ahead, please.
Very good morning. My name is Mazli Harun. I'm from Malaysia. I would like to ask for second presenters, Mr. I don't know, Mr. How do I call you? Is it Dr. Aleonis Papadopoulos?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry if I'm wrong. Okay. Just now you have discussed in details regarding the regulations related with European Union law and policy as well. So I'm not in economy. I'm not economist. I'm also in legal aspect as well. So what I want to know is that how far does the preparations by the national regulatory authority in Greece towards the enhancements the economic turmoil it's not only in Greece but also in European Union as well. So what
can you repeat the question? The
national regulatory authorities means that how far does the government itself prepared towards this particular economic turmoil? Okay, it's not only we just concern how European Union do to Greece, but how far does the Greece government itself, how far does the society, the communities in Greece to help their countries. For example, when Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea faced this particular situation in 97 till 99, also 2000, what we do is that I just want to share my experience where our society, for example, we buy our own products and our government suggests that we try to reduce import, and in the meantime, we try to explore a new import product in our own countries. That's what we do. And how I would like to know how far does the Greece government do regarding this matter?
Thank you. 30 seconds to answer.
There's a very short answer to that. I'm not an economist either, so, but I'm interested in political economy. I wouldn't be the competent person to respond, because I mean the basic difference is that we in Greece are not a totally independent country. The foremost tool that we lack by now is the depreciation of our national currency. There's no national currency anymore. I mean, that used to be the basic tool of a boost to our competitiveness, structural competitiveness problem. Now we don't have it. We have transferred it, together with other parcels of our state sovereignty, to the EU. And now that's a problem. There are no real big tools like nuclear bomb, like, you know, depreciation of our national currency. So,
okay. All right. Let's thank the presenters again for a very interesting session, and it's time for coffee.